Seguimos entonces con estas preguntas que nos hacemos para ver si vamos profundizando y acercándonos mucho a nuestra práctica, ¿no? Y como ejercicios prácticos, pues surgen estas preguntas. ¿Cómo se relacionan los usuarios con el espacio? ¿Cómo se conciben los espacios para los visitantes? ¿Y cuáles deben ser esas características especiales que deben tener esos espacios educativos? Cuando pensamos en experiencias pioneras y que con el tiempo se han consolidado con múltiples aportes a la reflexión sobre la experiencia educativa en espacios museísticos, pues hay sin duda un referente importante, el Exploratorium de San Francisco. Ellos son una cita obligada, más aún cuando acaban de inaugurar una nueva sede cerca al embarcadero de San Francisco, si no estamos mal. Y pues esta nueva inauguración ha sido una oportunidad de repensar nuevamente ese espacio, una oportunidad nuevamente de proponer todos los servicios que ellos ofrecen para el público, así como sus colecciones. Así que por ello, de verdad, hoy es un gusto presentar a Rob Semper. Él es director ejecutivo adjunto del Exploratorium de San Francisco. Entre sus responsabilidades se incluyen el diseño de exposiciones, medios de comunicación, formación docente, programas de investigación en actividades públicas, educativas y nuevos medios. Es autor de numerosos artículos y ha impartido numerosas conferencias en todo el mundo. Ha sido investigador principal en proyectos que incluyen el desarrollo de nuevos recursos en Internet, experimentación tecnológica enfocada a la mejora de la experiencia de los visitantes en el museo, y ha recibido numerosos reconocimientos, entre ellos destacan AAA Fellow en 2006, NSTA 2006, Faraday Science Communicator Award. Antes de unirse al Exploratorium en 1977 fue profesor de física, recibió su PhD en física de la Universidad de Johns Hopkins. Así que muchas gracias, Rob Semper, por estar aquí hoy.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm sorry I have to speak in English. I hope the interpreters can keep up, and many of you I know can follow along. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy about it, particularly because it gives me a chance to consolidate some of my thinking about space and museums. As you heard, we've just opened a new museum, and I'm going to give you some discussion about how we designed that space. But I also want to start and talk a little bit about space and museums in general, and give you some of my thoughts. As was mentioned, I'm a physicist. I came to the museum field in 1977 when I joined the Exploratorium. But I brought with me not only my interest in physics and in science education, but also a background in theater. And combining those, I think, served a platform for me to think about space and museums in general, and space and education in particular. Let's see how this works. So today what I want to do is talk about something very particular about space and also about place. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of space and time and place. I'm going to talk a little bit about the features of educational spaces and places. And then I want to talk about the Exploratorium and our new design there as an example of how we implemented some of these ideas in San Francisco. If we think about, look at this picture, what do we see? We see some people, we see some objects, we see some architecture, we see some design. All of these things are important to contemplate when we're thinking about educational spaces. If we take an abstraction of the space, we essentially have a traditional gallery, a box, an architectural design. But if I would want to take an even further abstraction, being a physicist, and of course the unfortunate part is when you invite physicists to come and talk, you invariably get a graph. So if you really want to abstract the space in general, what are we talking about? We're talking about something in 3 dimensions, 3 axes, in this case X, Y, and Z axis, the notion of space. So we think about space from a very fundamental level then, about what space is. And we realize that space, of course, also has a place. And the place of space, you might say the where, that space that we saw could be a space here in Madrid, could be a space here right in this building. So space, of course, can have an enhanced identity, which is it's where it's located. The physics of space, being 3 dimensions, could be anywhere. Where it is turns out to be quite important, and an important attribute for when we talk about space. It leads us to a notion of placeness, actually. But there's one other thing I want to talk about as we start to talk about space we sometimes forget, and I think is really critical when we think of spaces from an educational perspective. And that has to do with time. So being a physicist, again, I'll bring you a picture, the Minkowski space-time diagram. That observer spot that's right in the center, of course, is a space that's a person that's located not only in space, but in space at a particular time. And I would argue that our discussion about educational spaces, it's critical to talk about time as much as it is about space. And often we get caught up in a space discussion, which in a sense does not take into account the time perspective of the people engaged with that space. And if we're thinking about education, we need to think about both time and space. And of course, time has a particular feature about when it's happening, the famous clock in Greenwich. The whenness is kind of equivalent to the whereness. It's about the specific time something is happening, not the general time, and that's a critical feature. So if I bring all these together, I would argue that space plus time equals the experience that we're talking about, or where plus when equals the placeness that we're talking about. And these are important things to keep in mind as we start to talk about what kind of educational spaces we design for ourselves. Space and time are both important. In particular, I want us to focus on the locus of control between the designer of the space, the implementer of the space, the person that basically put the palette together, and the user. And think about the interplay between these two. And I'll argue that different kinds of educational spaces, there's a different ratio between the impact of the designer and the impact of the user. And I mean designer in a very broad sense, not just a visual designer. A teacher, for example, is a designer of what happens in the classroom where they're presenting. And also I want to make the point that where and when space becomes place is very, very instructive and important, because that adds a level of humanity to the notions of space. Placeness really is about our human experience in a particular place, in a particular space. So to start off, I want to talk about 2 stories in my experience that led me to thinking a lot about these kinds of topics, and in particular led me to think about what it means to design educational spaces. These are 2 different things that happened across my early career working at the Exploratorium that had an impact in my thinking. One was a study by Junie Diamond of family groups at the Exploratorium. She did her PhD research studying family groups as they went through the museum. The other is an installation of an exhibit of our work in a different place this installation was done in La Cité des Sciences in Paris. They both sort of dramatically showed something to me about the nature of educational spaces. The visitor study. Sometimes it appears when you go to visit museums, particularly science museums, that visitors, especially children, seem to be flitting about the museum, going from place to place, rapidly pushing buttons, rapidly interacting. And the question is often, invariably asked, if I go to those places and someone knows I'm from the museum, they say, are they really learning anything? Is any learning going on here? These people are just running around. They're having a good time, it's great, but are they really learning anything? So Judy Diamond, a PhD student at San Francisco, at Berkeley actually, studied family groups at the Exploratorium by following them around and noting their behavior. She was an ethologist. She used to study coyotes in the wild. She studied coyotes and cubs and their parents, studied them carefully, taking notes, what their behavior was like every minute, very much of a study. So she did that with family groups. She found groups of 2 adults and 2 kids, and she would follow them around through the museum, taking careful notes about what they were doing, when they were doing certain things, who was interacting with what. There's a lot of fascinating results about that. And here's a picture of the Exploratorium just to show you the environment that she was working within. Exploratorium, which is a museum of science, art, and human perception in San Francisco, which was started in 1969 by Dr. Frank Oppenheimer, is an environment that really provides the opportunity for the public to experience natural phenomena on their own, to make their own discoveries around the exhibits. So it's a very free-form kind of environment, very different than the gallery environment that we saw earlier. And Judy studied visitors as they went their way through this environment. And what she found, probably the key finding, at least for me the key finding was that if you followed visitors around, family groups around, you found that they spent a little bit of time at a lot of exhibits. In other words, they spent maybe, could have been 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 40 seconds at an exhibit, but they did that a lot of times. But then, invariably, they spent a lot of time at a small handful of exhibits, and those times could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes at an exhibit. So there was kind of a bimodal distribution of their activity. And these exhibits that they spent a lot of time at were different for each family group. They were not the same. It wasn't like the best exhibit in the Exploratorium. It was many different exhibits, but that was in general the pattern of behavior. And it's interesting to think about this behavior and why it happens, and to realize it happens for a variety of reasons. It happens because people find something they're interested in. One of the party, maybe one of the 4 people found something they're interested in. It might have happened because that exhibit was open and no one was standing around it, so it wasn't crowded. It might have happened because something caught their eye and there was another person there doing something interesting that they watched, and they decided to do that themselves. There was a lot of reasons why this happened. But the important part about this is it was actually a time study of the visitation through the space, and it illuminated the fact that the time part and the time experience was something very important. And for me, what it noticed is that often if you stand still, you get an exhibit eye view of the visitor. And so the fact that you saw all this frenetic activity and we asked the question, is anybody learning here, was actually a result of the fact that you were getting the exhibit perspective, not the visitor perspective. If you move like a visitor, you see a much different story. And I would encourage us all to think about spaces as if we were visitors as we pass through them, to understand what the dynamics is about that kind of visitation. So this was an important lesson for me because it really showed how the time dimension was critical in terms of thinking about the visitation, trying to understand what people did in spaces. The second example I want to give you was when we actually did an installation in Paris of an exhibit that we had designed on light and color. There's a number of our exhibits. We probably took over 100 exhibits that we had built on light and color to install in the new museum, which went open in Paris in '87. At the Exploratorium, these exhibits were actually loosely grouped, and it was our sense that it didn't matter which exhibit you went to first in terms of the learning enterprise. It was designed, the exhibits had very much of a deep pedagogy and relation. You could teach a course in light and color if you wanted to, but we weren't actually worried about which exhibit you saw first in the set. This is a picture again about the Exploratorium, which is a deeply browsable environment. This is the old Exploratorium. Deeply browsable environment that people made choices about where they go, when they wanted to go and see something. It was not dictated, in a sense, by the design. When we moved the exhibit over to the museum in La Villette in Paris, it was actually laid out originally by the designers before we got there to do the installation, because the exhibits were shipped ahead of time. And the exhibit set actually had a structure, a spatial structure set up by the design, which was quite different than what we had thought of from the design perspective at the Exploratorium. And it was quite a fascinating one, because it actually was a design that was a curricular design. It was designed in a sense with a subject matter. You can see refraction, reflection, diffraction. The exhibits are all laid out. It's very much like a table of contents in a book. It's an interesting design. It could have been an interesting design for the exhibition. It was not the one that we would have chosen from the Exploratorium perspective. And in fact, we came and actually moved all the exhibits around afterwards, much to the horror of the designer of the space. But I appreciated the design because I understood where it came from. It really came from the notion of trying to make the space, in a sense, operate very much almost like a textbook, like a collective, and actually kind of dictate a little bit the temporal activity through that space. The notion of it brought to me the idea that there's actually a couple different ways of designing space. You could design it on a conceptual learning progression. You can actually make the space have a way that you progress through it in a particular fashion. Or you can design the space possibly as an associative learning, where actually it's aggregation, where you associate one thing to another, but the particular order doesn't necessarily depend on what you finally get out of the entire experience. These are just different ways of thinking about space and designing them from an educational perspective. Realizing that this may or may not be so pertinent, this exhibit was in Paris, and I realized, of course, there's different ways you design cities, and sort of the same kind of thing, right? Paris is designed as a neighborhood. It's designed based around its neighborhoods. In fact, you go crazy as a New Yorker, as I was, coming to Paris for the first time and trying to find things, because you have to find them in a notion of finding the neighborhood and finding the next level of where something's located within that neighborhood. And you sort of get maps and books that work that way. This is the opposite, of course, of a city like New York or San Francisco, which is based on a grid system, where you sort of don't have to know exactly how to get somewhere. You can actually do it by, okay, you make so many moves this way north and so many moves this way east to get to your location. It, however, has some interesting problems in San Francisco, where they basically put the grids right over, forgetting about topology. So you have streets that basically are almost impassable with a car because they basically go up almost at a vertical angle. There's one more lesson I want to talk about before we look at some of the designs that we've worked on. And that's the fact that learners, because if we're talking about educational spaces, we have to remember that learners are an active participant in the learning process. And the dynamic of control between the designer, author, educator, and the learner is a critical feature if we're going to be studying educational spaces. And it's so interesting to me how often we forget that learners are the ones in charge of their own learning. Learning is an active process in the head. It's not a process that's coming and being stimulated from the outside. The person inside has to be doing work for learning to be occurring. In fact, if you really push on it and think about it and realize that learners do the learning, you realize that what you really are, if you're thinking about educational spaces, particularly if you try to think about an educational space in relation to another educational space, is that the learners are sort of immersed in an ecology of learning, kind of a distributed learning environment. If you think of a brain as part of a visitor, they go to a museum, they go to a school, they go to home, they watch media, they're part of a peer group, they go to the university, they go to out-of-school activities. They are basically carrying this vessel from place to place, and we in institutions tend to think of ourselves as self-standing places. We do all of our work in a design, most of the time independent of all these other environments. And yet the real way to think about learner space is to realize that your space, your learner space, is only part of a much larger learner space that the learner is engaged with. So again, the learner is the key feature. If we think about public spaces in terms of education and in terms of their relationship of space and time, I found it interesting to try to break these down just to help push this discussion a little further into three different kinds of spaces. A space that's sort of driven as a narrative space, a space that's driven, I'm calling it sort of a structured space, and a space that's driven sort of as a browsing space. And we can argue back and forth about whether these are the right categorizations. This is really just meant to put dimensions on a grid to think about all of these various and particular features. Let me talk about each of these three spaces. So narrative spaces are ones where there's really a very strong through line. The time of the experience is highly controlled. And I would argue that the center, of course, is a cinema where you have a film that's been produced by a director, a filmmaker, with a time running, with a very careful control of the experience. But in a sense, the school is the same way in terms of the classical school, people sitting in chairs being lectured to by a teacher. Down at the bottom right, I have actually an example of a narrative exhibit, an exhibition where actually there's a beginning, middle, and end, where you start, for whatever reason, there's either an historical perspective given or another perspective given by the curator in terms of an exhibition, typical of often major exhibitions in major museums that are structured, often traveling exhibits where people put together the life's work, in this case of Picasso, for example. These are all narrative kinds of structures in a space, and spaces are designed to maintain and hold these kind of narrative kinds of structures. So a structured space is a little different. It's a case where there is something structured in terms of time, but it's also true that you as a user visitor have a lot of mobility within that space to do what you want. I think the best example, I have a picture of a library here on the educational space. I probably should have put maybe a picture of a laboratory, a science laboratory or something, where you actually do the experiments in your own time, but you have a period, 2 hours to do this experiment in. It's got some structure around it, but you have some alternations inside that you have more flexibility as a user than you might in the things I was showing earlier. A sporting event is an interesting thing because it has a beginning, middle, and end. If you go to a sporting event, however, you can spend time watching it. You can spend time buying food in the food service. You can spend time watching the audience. You actually have a lot of ability to move around in that, even though it has a structure, a time it starts, a flow to it, a certain structure that works with the space and the architecture. And I tried to think of an example in the museum world, and I was trying to think of one case where basically there are visits you take to museums where you come very particularly to see something very special, but it's not part of an exhibition. You go to see Mona Lisa, for example, or you go to see the famous 3 parts of the 3 things that you have to see at the Louvre, or you go to the Museum of the Vatican to see a particular picture. So in a sense, you're in something that's structured, but you've decided to take your pathway through the structuring. And then finally, browsable space, or I call it sometimes sightseeing spaces. These are spaces which are really designed where almost all of the energy to go through the space is on the shoes of the visitor. Up in the left, you see a field trip to an outdoor space, an outdoor garden or a natural preserve. The notion of looking in a store window. Store windows are fascinating because they're designed with many things to see. The designer does not expect you to see everything in the store window, and you make active choices about what interests you to pay attention to. In the bottom, the Exploratorium, which has really been designed very much from a sightseeing motif, with the idea that visitors get attracted to something that they're curious about, that they see something interesting, and they spend time there on their own volition. Of course, each of these are designed. They're not like it's not that there's no design here, but the design is very much to let the audience and the visitor assume their own pathway through the experience. So if you look at these 3 spaces, you can kind of do an analysis of them, kind of talk about some of their features. And again, I'm just throwing this out as a way to sort of expand the thinking about space and time. Space and time in the narrative space is pretty tightly coupled. In a structured space, it gets more loosely coupled. In a sightseeing space, I would argue space and time is uncoupled in many respects. The user control is low in a narrative space, it's high in a sightseeing space. The driver, on the other hand, it's an educator driver, in other words, a teacher, a lecturer, a curator is in a sense driving the narrative, whereas in the sightseeing space, it's highly learner-driven. The placeness sense of a place, the fact that you're physically there, is lower in a narrative kind of experience. I mean, the story is sort of structured more in a narrative kind of experience. In a sightseeing space, it's much higher about the actual location. And I would argue there's a pedagogical notion at play. In the narrative spaces, it's fairly much of a transmission model. Someone has paid a lot of time and attention into how they think one can think about this particular experience, whether it's a film or whether it's a curated exhibition. In the sightseeing world, I talked about being associative. And structured is kind of interesting because it sort of says, I've made a space that has a lot going on. It's contained. There's kind of a mentorship, a way that we think, kind of a guide to what to do with it, but you have some ability to work on your own. Okay, so those are some principles. What I wanted to do now is talk about the design exercise we went through for the Exploratorium and show some of these principles in play. So the Exploratorium was an environment that was really designed to support the development of curiosity, to really foster inquiry and learner-centered education. And it was designed by providing physical experiences that people could make choices to do at the level of the individual. Many of our exhibits are tabletop size in general. And it was really a sense that people could be empowered to do their own learning and to really get to engage with science and nature by having this opportunity to explore the world on their own. It wasn't meant to be the only way to learn science. It wasn't meant to be, it's really meant to be, can people be encouraged to be curious about the world and make discoveries and get engaged that way. So the Exploratorium was actually founded and built in 1969 in an amazing building called the Palace of Fine Arts near the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco by a physicist, Dr. Frank Oppenheimer. And this building had amazing features. Most of it is, let me finish the story. So the story is in 2013, we moved the Exploratorium from its location near the Golden Gate Bridge to its new location in downtown San Francisco on the Embarcadero. We physically moved the whole place from where it was to this new location. Here's a picture of the new location. We have two piers, piers 15 and 17. We renovated it's an historic pier. We renovated pier 15, and the pier 17 we're holding on to as backup. You can see here that we're on the Embarcadero near North Beach and near the northern part of the city. The new location has a lot of interesting features. It's about 33,000 square meters of space, twice as big as the old location. It has amazing access to the outdoor, to the city, and to the bay. It allowed us to add new themes and new experiences. We could improve the educational development features, educator development features. Our online work could increase. And we have a building that we are working to have as a goal net energy zero in terms of its energy use, using bay water heating and cooling and solar cells on the roof. I want to talk a little bit, though, about this process of design for the building and how our thinking went in terms of the design. Here's a picture of the Palace of Fine Arts where the Exploratorium started in 1969. It was a completely empty structure, no columns, an amazing structure actually, because it had this whole complete freedom to build inside. And I would say the Exploratorium's whole ethos was shaped, in fact, by this existing empty space. After about 43 years, we had managed to fill the space with exhibits, with buildings, with the necessary support you need to have an operating museum. All of this was built sort of organically over the 43 years. And as a result, we learned a lot about what a museum like this should be like, what the space should be like, how to make this space very effective. I mentioned before, the space is really designed to be very much of a browsable space. Frank used to talk about it being like a walk through the woods of phenomena. That is similar to taking a walk through woods where some things might interest you, other things might not, but you have a lot of free form in terms of how you investigate it. I mentioned about the piers 15 and 17. These are again two pictures of the two piers. Again, Pier 15 was a blank slate. It was an empty building when we started it. This building was about 100,000 square feet or 10,000 square meters of flat, empty, open space. And we renovated the entire building, brought it up to earthquake standards, and designed and built the building with all of the knowledge that we sort of had over the last time about what we really wanted to have in this new museum. So this is a picture of the interior of the building. And I think, is there a laser here? Yes, there it is. It's kind of complicated to show, but I want to talk about how we did the design. So the building, this is the street side of the building. And this is a pier. It's 880 feet long, so it's about the length of a city block, New York City block. A very long, narrow building. And what we did in the design, we actually built 3 buildings inside of the original pier. So it was completely empty and flat. We built 3 buildings which had a second floor, and on the second floor we put all of the offices, the design development group, the teacher education groups, and the public is therefore on the first floor. These buildings separated the space into large galleries, and so here's a gallery, here's a gallery, here's a gallery, here's a gallery, and then there was one new building built at the end, the observatory, which is a gallery unto itself. So we ended up with buildings with passageways underneath them, connectors underneath them, that connect public galleries. One of the important things we wanted to do was move the entire staff into the one building, back into one particular space, and put them in the place where they're effectively on display and part of the exhibition design. The Exploratorium's always had sort of an inside-out feature. There was no behind the scenes. The behind the scenes were always in the scenes. And what that means, among other things, is that the activation of people building the space, building the exhibits, building the environments, the web, whatever, in a sense becomes part of the public spectacle that people can see when they come to visit us. The thing about the Exploratorium that's important to know is it's actually the marriage of a physical public space and a laboratory for the development and creation of experiences for the public to learn about nature and science. And the lab is actually the public space that people come and visit us. So it's like visiting a public laboratory. So the fact that people work there is a very important part of the design. The other thing we tried to do was, oops, let me go back up here. The other thing we tried to do in the design was to really work with the outside space. So this pier space here is also public, paid public space where we have a lot of exhibits outside. And then the whole pier has a public walkway around the whole building. One of the things that we noticed when we studied museums before we did our renovation is how many museums have sort of walled themselves off from the city. A mention was made about the sort of the antithesis to that, which is Beaubourg, where they basically put themselves into the city. And that model, I think, is a really great one. Still in all, we saw many, many museums, many modern new museums, certainly science museums, being built that look like citadels. They're away from the museum. Usually they're surrounded by a parking lot or something like that. They had really little connection to the public, to the audience. We consciously made the museum physically accessible by having this public walkway around the outside. There's also a public plaza in the front, which you put a lot of exhibits in, but which are not necessarily part of the paid space. While I'm on this picture, I can show you this front part, this built part, this is called the bulkhead of the building, is where we have retail, food, and we have classrooms, and we have a space, our forum, which is called a theater, here, right here in this space. So that becomes kind of a public civic side to the museum. Now let me show you some pictures of the inside and try to talk a little bit about the design as we went through it. The building itself was historic, and it meant that we had to maintain an experience of the history of the building. So we had to show this, we were required to show the roof, the trusses, as much as possible, keep the building in its original shape. For us, that turned out to be very useful because it meant the building had a utilitarian sense to it. It was not a polished building. It was a building that actually was a working building. It was a working pier. Now it's a working museum. And we were able to actually find it very valuable to have that kind of open space. Here's another picture of it showing the interior. You can see it's very much designed with an openness. You can see here, this is the second floor where there's offices and staff, and you can see the public is on the ground floor, every so often going underneath some of the office space that's on the second floor. The building, as I said, made galleries. These galleries, each of them have actually a somewhat different feel, and they give us the opportunity to explore the design of galleries in an interesting way because each of them are separated enough from the other galleries that they can have a different experience. That was not the case in our old building where it was all one room and everything sort of impinged on everything else. It was also something that from a museology perspective was a nightmare. This building had tremendous amounts of windows and light. It was designed to be very low energy use, so therefore all of the windows were left open, the lighting was quite low. We had to therefore grapple with how to actually design, in a museum design perspective, something which had lots of windows. And actually found that we were able to manage that through a lot of design issues and pretty much realized that we could actually work in a space that was well lit. The old Exploratorium had no windows, it had some skylights, so it's kind of moving from really darkness into light. Here's a picture of the connecting corridors between the large galleries. One of the interesting things about the space here is that these have relatively low ceilings for a museum. And yet what you have because of the compression of that space, and of course when you move into the large galleries, even a sense of the galleries themselves are much larger because you've gone through this, you have the psychological perspective because you've gone through this sort of lowered space. The space was designed so that the exhibits, effectively that the architecture was as neutral as possible to the exhibit set that we were providing because we actually build exhibits every year. We build 20 or 30 new exhibits a year. The collection is always changing in one way or another, and so we wanted to make sure the space could handle the movement of exhibits and not be fixated that way. There was one new building that was built because we had to tear a building down, and that was the observatory built at the end of the pier. This is a glass box building with a restaurant on the first floor and an exhibit space on the second floor. The exhibit space actually isn't very transparent, and that's because of energy considerations. These glass windows have a lot of frits in them or lines in them so that there's not a lot of solar insulation coming in. And also because there's a new ordinance in San Francisco that you can't have glass windows because of bird strikes, because birds run into them. And so because of that, now almost all the new windows are going to have some sort of fretting in them. I'll show you on the inside, though, that actually they're quite transparent. Here you can sort of see the fretting, but they're actually quite transparent windows. So this observatory provides a platform and an opportunity to look out into the world of the bay on the one hand, look back at the world of the city. It was really an idea of sort of adding placeness to where we were. The place, that end of the pier, is really an important part of the Exploratorium experience now. We also, as I mentioned, were able to add outdoor exhibits in this outdoor plaza and provide, this is a ticketed outdoor space that we're slowly filling up with exhibits as we build new ones. Back here, you can see one particular new exhibit, which is a bridge that has an art piece. It's a fog bridge. It has an art piece by Japanese artist Fugucho Nakaya, and this piece, every 20 minutes or so, fills up with fog. And of course, everyone thought we shouldn't bring fog to San Francisco. We didn't really need to do that. But in fact, the piece has turned out to be an amazingly popular attraction. And one of the things we're doing in the outside space is looking at other installations that will take advantage of this very large open area on the outside. A number of the exhibits are actually allowing us to talk about the environment because they talk about the water, they let us talk about the air, what's happening in the currents, what's happening in the bay. It's really allowed us to kind of create an exhibitation of the outside world. I'll show you a few of the galleries. This is the West Gallery, which is really about human phenomenon. We're doing exhibits on the science of sharing, other kinds of exhibits that relate to cognition, memory, language, things that are really about us as human beings. The South Gallery is actually about making and tinkering. We've added a place where, near our exhibit development shop, where people can actually make things. They learn how to tinker, they actually fabricate things, something that's really become a popular activity through, you may have heard of Make Magazine and the Makers Fair, which have really become an interesting enterprise, and this lets this happen within the museum. These people are standing in front of a very fanciful clock built by the artist Tim Hunkin. The Central Gallery, which is where our traditional exhibits of the Exploratorium in light and color, sound and perception exist. These guys were really unhappy with the windows, so they managed to find out a way to block most of them. Because of course the drama of brightly colored lights, great prismatic spectrum was really important for their area. And this is the East Gallery, which is about living systems. It has amazing windows looking out on the bay. It's where our life science collection is established. We're doing a lot of exhibits now on plankton. People can go out and actually gather plankton from the bay and come back and measure it with a microscope. It's really a beautiful space. It's also one of the spaces that's very often used for rentals and for other kinds of activities for the museum. Our exhibit development shop is featured right in the center of the museum and is publicly accessible on display. And here you can see the exhibit development shop here. Here you can see some of the staff offices, which are connected by a catwalk to another office. The notion to see things being made is a really important feature of the Exploratorium because it's rare to see things being manufactured these days. It's very hard to see that happen. So having the shop on display was a very important thing for us to do. The floor staff of the Exploratorium are high school kids, and they have demonstration stations in each of the big galleries. Here they're actually doing a dissection of a cow's eye, where you can actually take the lens and you can see how the eye works, see the retina, see the cow's eye. A very, very popular and sometimes exciting demonstration. And the outside plaza turns out to be a place that we're programming. We have a market days, which we're having events and things on the outside to bring the public into our space, even if it's a free kind of environment for us. We built a forum. This is a very special kind of theater for us. It was designed with a lot of social experiences in mind. The public can see each other as well as the stage. There's actually a bar back here. So instead of building a traditional auditorium, we decided we wanted to create something that was more convivial. This was actually based on a design of a rock and roll club in Aspen, Colorado. Something that provided intimacy between the stage and the people. The seats are all movable, so we can actually design it with different kinds of functions and features. And it has a sound system, very interesting sound system that is active acoustics, meaning we can change the sound reverberation and the experience of the space electronically to be as large or small as we want in terms of whatever is happening on the stage. When we were designing the space, there were 4 big ideas that we had in mind. One is this notion that the new building is a creative studio. It's actually a place that makes things, not just a place that shows things. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about where we're putting the exhibit development shop, where we're putting the biolab, where we put things that the public could see us creating the next set of stuff for the Exploratorium. That it felt it was a place of action, not a passive place. The observatory was a very important idea for us because it establishes the placeness of where we were. It establishes an opportunity for us to talk about what was happening in that place. It serves as a location to really help people begin to look at how to observe the world around them. The town square idea, the fact that it was a campus, we have 2 buildings. The other building will be a future part of the museum, but it's actually a place for a public gathering as well. We very much took to heart the things we saw at Beaubourg and other places where the outside space connected to the museum turned out to be as important as what happened inside. And the fact that it was a pier, we took the pier literally and figuratively. The pier is actually a great place of exchange. It's designed for stuff to be fluid inside and out. It's a place of producing to reach an audience beyond the walls. We thought very much of the place as not being just everything happening at the Exploratorium at the pier, but being a hub for a lot of activities happening throughout the Bay Area and around the world. So these design principles are what helped us think about the space itself. I mentioned the major galleries already and where they are. One thing to point out is that the space, because of in a sense, the ability to talk about physics, living systems, human behavior, and to be able to be outside as well as inside, means that we actually get to talk about the environment in a very interesting way. And in my perspective, we can talk about the environment in a very authentic way about all of these things turn out to be important if you're going to actually study the environment and study some of the environmental issues that we have today in the world at large, because it depends both on the physics, the living systems, but also human behavior, what the outcomes are going to be about the challenges that we're faced with in the environment. There's a lot of special facilities. I mentioned the observatory already, the tinkering studio, which is where people can do making. We have a webcast studio on the floor, which allows us to connect the space with the world at large through the internet. The outdoor exploratorium I mentioned, and the forum. And then there's another interesting idea, which is that the whole pier, we're calling the wired pier. We have a lot of instrumentation on the pier that measures earth tremors, measures the weather, measures the bay water, measures what's happening in the atmosphere. In a sense, the pier has become an instrument, a scientific instrument, and the public can actually observe how we're actually measuring the environment from a physical sense and from a biological sense. And this is just a picture to show some of the activities, the workshops we put in place, the media production places. So it is a studio, a place of action. And just to wrap up, I'll show you a little bit about the kind of topical things that we're working on. We're continuing our work on physics and perception, which is our core work. It turns out perception is a great thing to be exhibiting because it means that the public is fascinated, of course, by themselves, by the things that they see, the things that they hear. And tying perception with the physics, like light and color and sound, turned out to be a very rewarding way to get popular interest and also to sort of be able to facilitate this kind of sightseeing approach. We're moving heavily into social science, trying to exhibitize the issues about society, social science. There's a lot of research now that's happening on this. Probably the most famous picture that's on Instagram now is this picture here of visitors drinking out of an unused toilet. This is actually based on scientific research about where people's barriers are in terms of where they think things are acceptable or not acceptable. And this thing turns out to be an amazing experience to watch people at this particular exhibit. As I mentioned, we're moving our exhibits also into environment. We're doing outdoor exhibits and also doing things on plankton. Plankton, there's a lot of museums in the Bay Area that do fish and that sort of thing. Plankton turns out to be very important. The plankton in the Bay change dramatically by week, depending on ocean conditions. There's a tremendous amount of biology and food source in plankton. It's probably the base of the food chain in the world, certainly in the seas. And so we decided to take a lot of exhibit work on that area. The observatory I mentioned to you, part of this was to also design and develop new ways to do visualization about the bay. And so this bay model over here is a topographical model which we project different data sets on to show people everything from trends in earthquakes or the bay currents to population trends in the Bay Area. Tinkering, I mentioned the idea of making and personalized making, the fact that people can create something in their own space based on their experience at the Exploratorium. The forum allows us to have a place of conversation and dialogue relates to our exhibits. The forum actually connects both to the public street and also to the exhibit side. So we can have exhibits and then have people come in to talk about them in the forum itself. We also have been working a lot on using the facility as a production facility for the online world so that the things that we do not only happen within the space, but happen out in the world at large for our visitors. And finally, it's been very interesting in that new location to realize that we have new partners. We're able to dock research vessels at our museum, probably one of the few museums that actually has a working port dock at the end of it. So scientific research vessels like from the National Ocean Atmospheric Agency come by and their researchers can talk to the public. At the same time, right next to us are a lot of companies and corporations, including Autodesk, that's doing public spaces as they start to evolve new kinds of technology. So we're partnering with all of them to use our space as a place to be a partnership. So in conclusion, we tried to take a lot of the notions of space that I was talking about, space and time, some of our past experience, and move them into this new Exploratorium. And we just opened in April. So far, the response has been very dramatic. We're very pleased with the success from an audience perspective, but we're also very pleased that most people came and have said, wow, we were really afraid that you would lose some of the magic of the old place when you moved to the new place, and that didn't seem to happen. It seems like it's the Exploratorium, only more so. So far, we're very happy about this. We're very tired. It was a 10-year process just to get this building in place. But I encourage all of you to come and visit and to see how it fits this idea of space, educational space, space and time. Thank you.